My name is Steve Kosack, and I'm an assistant professor at the Kennedy School and an affiliate of the Ash Center. And today I'm talking about a book I've just finished called The Education of Nations. In the book, I try to set out a framework that can be used to understand when a government will invest in mass education. So the framework is intended to allow a person to quickly assess how likely a government is to invest in mass education as opposed to concentrating its resources on more elite-oriented education. In researching the book, I did an in-depth analysis of more than half a century of education policies in three very different developing countries: Taiwan, Ghana, and Brazil. And I found something quite surprising. Political scientists generally like to think that governments are more likely to invest in poor citizens when the government is democratically elected. It's very intuitive to think that leaders in democracies should need the poor's support more than leaders in autocracies, since leaders in democracies need to win over a majority of voters in order to stay in office, and many of those voters will be poor. And across the world today, and most recently in the Arab Spring, we see this powerful idea that poor citizens who want a government that is responsive to their material needs should seek democracy, and that once they have it, they can kind of relax, secure in the knowledge that the institutions of democracy will force government leaders to serve them, and not some narrow elite when making their policies and distributing public resources. And my idea, in fact, when I began this project, was that governments should invest more in poor citizens when they became democratic, and specifically should invest more in the education of poor citizens. But that is not what I found. What I found instead is that this electoral incentive is rarely enough to overcome another incentive that a leader faces: to serve citizens who are organized. There's very good reason to think that leaders, at least in developing countries, perceive much less of a threat to their power from voters than they perceive from organized interest groups like the business community, large landowners, or the military. Organized interest groups can directly threaten a leader, and they can also indirectly influence the electorate through emotional appeals, through carefully selecting wedge issues about which some poor citizens care more than they care about their material welfare, and through spreading information that might damage the government's support among its voting base. And what that means is that in order for the masses or for the average citizens to be important to leaders staying in power, and therefore for leaders to have the incentive to serve them with mass education, among other things, the masses need to be organized too. And when they are organized, the masses are generally far more powerful than organized elites, because while elites have more resources, the masses have numbers. And it's a rare government that can ignore the masses in the streets, and a rare leader who wouldn't love to have their support. What I also found is that the masses rarely can organize themselves. Instead, they need help organizing. They need a leader or an organization like a union or a religious organization to take on the effort of building organizational structures that keep the poor organized and politically active. And in the book, I call this actor a political entrepreneur of the poor. And I find that whenever governments become associated with political entrepreneurs of the poor, they reliably invest in the education of the masses. On the other hand, when governments are not associated with political entrepreneurs, well then, instead of investing in mass education, they invest in elite-oriented education systems, in which many of the resources go to universities whose access is highly restricted, so that it's very hard for poor students to gain admission. And importantly, this was the case in both democracies and autocracies. In fact, it was more often the case that autocracies invested heavily in mass education than democracies. In all three of the countries that I examined, the first indigenous governments to expand mass education were all autocratic. And more important, where democratic governments in these three countries did invest heavily in mass education, in every instance they were simply continuing the policies of a previous autocratic government. Let me give you just one example to illustrate this puzzle from Ghana. In 1951, Ghana was still the British Gold Coast. But in that year, the British ceded control over education policymaking to a new government of Ghanaians. At that time, only 4% of Ghanaians had ever attended school, and the entire country was enrolling just 140,000 students in its primary schools. But one of the new government's very first acts on taking power was to implement what it called the Accelerated Plan for Development in Education. The government built almost 5,000 primary schools, particularly in rural areas. It abolished all tuition fees at primary schools, and it tried to provide the best teachers possible by opening dozens of teacher training centers and by consciously paying teachers more than they could earn in occupations demanding similar qualifications. In January 1952, more than 110,000 children began primary school, more than twice as many as in the previous year. And by 1966, the government was providing quality primary education to more than 1.1 million students, an increase of almost 800% in just 15 years. Now, for a political scientist, the puzzle of Ghana is that its government at the time was highly autocratic and quite repressive. So it was not the kind of government that our theories tell us should have been investing in the education of poor Ghanaians. But what I found was that Ghana made these investments because its leaders were political entrepreneurs of the poor. They wanted to rule Ghana when it became independent, and the only way they could do that was to organize poor Ghanaians and try their best to keep them happy. Only with their support could those leaders stay in power. And what all this implies, I think, is an important corrective to the expectations about democracy and democratic institutions that are currently felt by many citizens in developing countries. Democracy is laudable in many ways, and I would certainly rather live in a democracy than an autocracy. But it is notable that even as citizens of many developing countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, even as they are mobilizing to try to overthrow autocratic regimes and elect new, more responsive leaders, citizens of mature democracies are increasingly seeing their leaders as unresponsive and are thus also finding it necessary to mobilize in an effort to put pressure on those leaders to make policy more responsively. I was struck by a young Spaniard who last summer, after millions had taken to the streets across Europe to protest what they saw as their governments caring much more about what the banks needed than about jobs and basic needs of the majority of their citizens. This young Spaniard told a New York Times reporter that, quote, "Our parents are grateful because they're voting. We are the first generation to say that voting is worthless." Now, I wouldn't agree that voting is worthless. As I said, I would personally much rather live in a democracy than an autocracy. But when it comes to making policies that seek to meet the material needs and demands of poor citizens, democracy is just clearly no substitute for the hard work of political organizing. Political leaders serve those whose support they need to stay in power. That is the iron law of politics. And democracy doesn't necessarily make poor citizens indispensable to a leader's survival. Instead, we should be looking to organization and political entrepreneurship. These are far better guides to whether a government will try to make policy that serves poor citizens.